Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, dubious speculation. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out this sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Also, do remember we have the bracket challenge. If you want to join it, winner gets a 1-year subscription to Into the Cryptoverse Premium. Password is BTC.D. Links in the description below. So I wanted to do another video here on Bitcoin, mainly because the price has been moving relatively quickly, and I just wanted to sort of provide an update on where we are. The video yesterday, I think Bitcoin was at like 65K. The day before that, it was at 68K. And so, you know, with it moving $3,000 on a daily basis, could make some sense to provide an update. So the first thing I will say is that at this point, and this is the same thing we said back over here in January, right? At this point, this correction is only 15%, right? Only 15%. So it's still in line with prior corrections. And if you were to look at prior corrections, you can see they were 20 to 22% or so. And so far, this correction is within the realm of what we have previously seen, right? There's no doubt about it. It's not like 15 to 20% corrections. We shouldn't be a stranger to them because we've seen 4 of them occur throughout this entire bull market that has lasted basically since the end of 2022. So at this point, it's still a correction like normal. Now, it could evolve into something more than that, but it hasn't just yet. And what I would look for is what happens at the reaction to the 8-week moving average. I think the 8-week is what is going to provide the key here going into the halving. Okay? I think the 8-week SMA provides the key. And the reason I say that is because the 8-week moving average sits about 20 to 22% down. Okay? So as long as Bitcoin holds the 8-week moving average, then all is good, right? The issue with the bull market support band, it has been so long since we tested it. So if we go below the 8-week SMA and then go down to the 20-week SMA, there's a good chance we're not actually going to hold it. So as long as we hold the 8-week moving average, then the party could still theoretically continue, right? As long as the 8-week moving average is held. At this point, it has been 22 weeks since we tested the bull market support band. History shows you really want to test it every 3 to 4 months to hold it as support. Because it's been 22 weeks, you know, it's been since October, we're sort of past that window. And so the implication of that is that, well, whenever we do test it, there's a good chance we're not going to hold it as support. So for the momentum to hold, the bulls are going to want to hold the 8-week moving average, which is going to be around 57 to 58K. So if Bitcoin were to drop to, you know, 59K, 58K, 60K, whatever, as long as that holds, then the risk on mentality continues. I've said many times, my view is risk on until 56% Bitcoin dominance, right? I've said it many times. That doesn't mean that it has to put in new highs until then, but it could. And we're still not at 56% yet. I think at 56%, there's no longer that liquidity in the altcoin market that could theoretically make its way back over to Bitcoin. So with the FOMC here about to occur, I wanted to show you guys an interesting pattern by Bitcoin just in relation to interest rates. All right. So if we were to overlay interest rates over the price of Bitcoin USD, you'll see that this 2019 rally, you'll see what essentially happened is it really first, when the Fed paused, right, Bitcoin sort of sold off after the pause, and then it had about, from this level, right, from that low, it then rallied up about 300%, right, about 300% after the correction following the pause. Okay, so when you look at it over here, you see that same pause. What happened? Bitcoin dropped, right? It dropped to around 25K, just below 25K. Now, what you'll see is a very interesting pattern where your first move up, right? You have your sort of your slow grind up, and then a big move up followed by consolidation for a few weeks, right? We had the same thing over here, right? We had a slow move up followed by a big move and then consolidation for a few weeks as the spot ETF launched. Then after that, we had another move up where we then consolidated and we basically back tested, we retested that 8-week moving average. Right, you can see here, we tested that 8-week moving average the week of June 3rd. We didn't actually get, we actually didn't get all the way down to it. We got within a few $100s of it. We were really close to it, but we didn't actually test it. But we got within a couple, within $400 or so. What's interesting is that, this move from the low here to sort of this consolidation area, right? Like this consolidate, like we're at this wick high. That was about a 67% move, give or take, right? About a 67% move. Now, from here to that high, you can see that Bitcoin went up more, right? It was about a 92% move. A 92% move. If you were to take it from this low to this high, that's about a 170% move, right? So from that low to this high before we corrected back to the 8-week moving average. So if you take this all the way up here, you can see it's a little bit more, right? 190%. 190%. But what I find interesting is that if you actually take it from this low here in December and not this one, you get that same number. You get 190%, right? So essentially what you have is a 190% rally from around the time that the Fed paused rates, right? 190% rally. And then a pretty sharp pullback to the 8-week moving average, right? A pretty sharp pullback potentially to the 8-week moving average. Then from that point, Bitcoin had a final rally that broke alt Bitcoin pairs down, right? It broke alt Bitcoin pairs down. So we've certainly had some risk off signals. For instance, we've seen gold go above 2070. We've seen, the USDT dominance already go below 4%. We've seen a lot of that stuff already happen. But one thing we haven't seen happen yet are alt Bitcoin pairs breakdown. And what's really interesting is if you look closely at this 8-week moving average, like when it tested it the week of June 3rd. June 3rd. Now go over and look at alt Bitcoin pairs. Where were they June 3rd? They were up here, right? They had just bounced off of the range low, right? So there was this range low here, and then they bounced June 3rd, alt Bitcoin pairs topped out. And then they began the plunge. So look today, alt Bitcoin pairs, they just bounced off the range low, right? And they're starting to turn again. I've said before, right? I've said many, many times that I think that alt Bitcoin pairs are going to break down in April. I think in the halving month, I think is when they break down. And again, could they break down on a Bitcoin dump? It's possible, right? It's possible. But if it plays out like last time and they break down on a Bitcoin rally, then you should be aware of that pattern, right? You should be aware of that pattern where we tested that 8-week moving average, right? We tested it. We held it as support. And then we rallied one last time. So if you were to look at this sort of from the low here, how long it had been since Bitcoin had left the 20-week SMA, right? By the time we actually tested it, it had been like well over, 5-6 months. And that's why we ended up not holding it. So that's why I'm saying I think a lot of this comes back down to whether Bitcoin holds the 8-week moving average. If it holds the 8-week moving average like it did right here in 2019 after a 190% rally following a Fed pause or around that time, right? Fed pause right there, 190% rally, test the 8-week, right? Fed pause right here, you get that same type of 190% rally, right? Test the 8-week moving average. So, but again, there's no guarantee that we hold it. We have to hold it. If we hold it and Bitcoin rallies back up to the range high and then breaks higher, that I think is where alt Bitcoin pairs break down. Now, it's hard to know if it's a lower high that forms, if it's a higher high that forms, if it's a double top that forms. In 2019, it was a higher high. In 2019, it was a much higher high, right? In fact, if we were to rally as high as it did back there, I mean, if you look at where Bitcoin was when it tested the 8-week moving average, right, it got about another 84% rally, right? I mean, that would get you into six figures if Bitcoin were to follow that path. The reason it's, I mean, and look, that could certainly happen, and I think we should look at the 8-week moving average to see if it actually holds. The one thing that is a little like off is that when alt Bitcoin pairs over here saw the plunge, ETH Bitcoin, right? I mean, again, they alt Bitcoin pairs had bounced, and ETH Bitcoin had also, it was well off its range lows back then. If you were to go take a look at like ETH Bitcoin, you can see that it had also bounced and was up here, right? It was right here the week of June 3rd, right? Well off of its lows. But right now, it's not well off its lows, right? It wouldn't take that much to break ETH Bitcoin off support, right? So that I mean, and again, we could draw this a little bit lower to where that wick actually is, but rather than being way up here, like it was, it's already all the way back down here. The reason why that's important is because as ETH Bitcoin drops, there's that liquidity that flows from Ethereum to Bitcoin. And with Ethereum being number 2 by market cap, it means something, right? There's a lot of liquidity there for Bitcoin to tap into. I've said before, right? Risk on until 56% dominance. The reason why I say that is because that's the level at which point ETH Bitcoin and alt Bitcoin pairs, I think, have durably broken down. We're not there yet. And again, when I say risk on, that doesn't necessarily have to mean a new high. It could be a bounce into a lower high, or it could be a higher high, right? But what I think needs to happen, I think what ultimately has to happen is that liquidity from the altcoin market has to go back over to Bitcoin, right? I think it has to go back over to Bitcoin. And you can go through the list, right? I mean, you can see there's so many altcoins that are nearing their range lows. Some of them have already broken down, right? Matic Bitcoin has already broken down. ADA Bitcoin still has a little ways to go to break down, right? But again, I mean, if you look at where it was back in June 3rd of 2019, it was a little bit higher than where it is today. But again, it was ultimately a Bitcoin rally that broke it off of support. And you can see that it's trending towards support. And we're trending into the halving month, right? April is the halving month. If you were to look at a year-to-date ROI of Bitcoin, you can see there was also a correction 2024, right? There was also a correction in 2021 around the same time. And it ultimately bottomed out on day 84. We're currently on day 80, right? So in 4 more days, theoretically. Give or, plus or minus a day or two. So I'm saying like April, right? If Bitcoin were to bounce in April, I think it's important to remain open-minded for everyone, right? Rather than assume it has to go to a certain price, right? Rather than say, all right, well, it has to go to this price, right? It has to be a lower high, or it has to be a higher high, or it has to go to 6 figures, or it has to go to, whatever the crazy price predictions that people are putting out. What if instead of saying all of that, instead of saying this is the price it goes to, we just say this. We say, we'll be open-minded. I will be open-minded until all Bitcoin pairs have broken down. That's my view, right? I'm open-minded about Bitcoin USD as long as alt Bitcoin pairs have not broken down. But if we go into a situation where alt Bitcoin pairs have broken down, then whatever the price of Bitcoin USD is at that point, I think that means something, right? Whether it's a lower high, right, or whether it's a higher high, right? Whether if Bitcoin were to take out the prior high, and I don't know what would ultimately happen or what it would take, right? I don't know what it's going to take by Bitcoin to break alt Bitcoin pairs down because a lot of it depends on if altcoins keep pace, right? If altcoins can't keep pace with Bitcoin, then it wouldn't take much for them to break down. But if a lot try to sort of tag along for the ride, then what happens, right? If a lot of these altcoins try to tag along for the ride, then that means Bitcoin just has to go higher and higher to ultimately break them down. So when I look at a chart like this, and people keep telling me, well, where is Bitcoin going to go on its USD pair? I would go back to this idea of risk on until alt Bitcoin pairs break down, which is basically 56% dominance. This hinges on the idea that Bitcoin holds the 8-week moving average, right? Because again, I mean, back over here in 2019, what essentially happened is that Bitcoin, it had this correction back to the 8-week SMA, and then it had one final move up as alt Bitcoin pairs broke down. One last move up as alt Bitcoin pairs broke down. Right? This was the week of June 3rd. And then you had 3 weeks in a row, June 10th, June 17th, June 24th. Bitcoin basically just went straight up. And during that time, those 3 weeks, that's where alt Bitcoin pairs went straight down. And it was on the week of June 24th where alt Bitcoin pairs finally broke support. And that is where Bitcoin went from risk on to risk off, right? When alt Bitcoin pairs broke down. Look at it on the chart, Bitcoin USD. You draw the line through, right? That is where Bitcoin went from risk on to risk off. When alt Bitcoin pairs broke down, right there, June 24th. And so I don't know, I don't know if it leads to a higher high. I don't know if it leads to a lower high, but I would just be open-minded and say that's what I would need to see. I would need to see alt Bitcoin pairs break down, and then from that level, I think that a lot of those risk-off signals are in. So far, we have some of them, right? I mean, gold broke out, USDT dominance went below 4%. A lot of things have happened, right? But we still have not seen alt Bitcoin pairs break down. And I think that is what ultimately needs to happen. So, if we're looking at the price of Bitcoin and it's April and it's at whatever price, let's say it's at 70K, if alt Bitcoin pairs have not broken down, then that would imply there's more liquidity to go back into Bitcoin. If alt Bitcoin pairs have broken down, then I would say that's it. It just depends on what it actually takes to get them to break down, right? And again, it's really impossible to know. I don't really know. I mean, to be completely honest, the altcoin market has been much more resilient than I ever thought it was going to be. I mean, dominance of Bitcoin has gone up. Don't get me wrong, right? It has gone up a lot. But at the end of the day, despite the fact that it has gone up a lot, it hasn't gone up as quickly as I thought, right? Alts have held on longer, much longer than I thought they would. And so, when you're sort of thinking about what is it going to take, I don't know. I don't know exactly how high it has to go in order for those alts to break down. And again, right now, everyone, I mean, we're Bitcoin's down $10,000, right? Who are we kidding? I mean, right? There's no guarantee that we even get a bounce off the 8-week moving average. That's the other thing. I mean, there are cases where alt Bitcoin pairs break down on Bitcoin dumps. That has happened. It doesn't happen as frequently as rallies, right? But I mean, there are cases. Here's an example. or there are prior examples from like, sort of prior rallies, but a lot of them are on Bitcoin rallies, right? I mean, this one here was on a Bitcoin rally, I believe, July, where all Bitcoin pairs broke down. This was also on a Bitcoin rally. Sorry, let me. So they broke down there on a Bitcoin rally. They also broke down here on a Bitcoin rally. So right, like in all three of these cases, they broke down on Bitcoin rallies. There are examples where they break down on Bitcoin dumps. Here might be an example, right, where they went below the range low there in sort of that dump into the summer of 2022. So there are examples where like Bitcoin pairs bleed on Bitcoin dumps, right? If you were to overlay Bitcoin USD, you can see that Bitcoin was plummeting, and so too was the altcoin market. So that's why I think we have to think like, well, they normally break down on Bitcoin rallies, but it's possible they could break down on a Bitcoin dump. I would say, look, it's going to depend on if Bitcoin holds the 8-week. That's what I think. If Bitcoin holds the 8-week moving average, then I think that it gets a bounce into the halving. So if this holds, right, if this level holds just below 60K, right, the 57 to 60K range, if that holds in March, then I think you sort of get that bounce into the halving, and then we figure out if it resolves into a higher high, a lower high, a double top, whatever it may be. And again, like back over here in 2019, after that 190% rally, we had that sort of that pullback. It was about an 18 to 19% drop. Let me get it exactly, right? Because if the 190% rally, so it was a 18% drop. 18%. So to go look at where we are right now by Bitcoin from that level, 18% would put you at right around 60K, right? So it'd be kind of interesting if it went below 60K to like say 59K. The reason why that'd be interesting is because this low here was 39K, right? 38, 39K. So what happens if this one ends up being 58, 59K? Back over here, a lot of people were asking me, well, should they sell in preparation for a pre-halving dump? And I was like, guys, what if that is the pre-halving dump? I know a lot of people want it to go lower, but what if that is the pre-halving dump? And now Bitcoin's, $20,000 higher. So I'd say the same thing again. If it goes into that 60 to 59K level, 58K to 60K, something like that, that will be the critical level. If it holds as support, then you likely get a rally into the halving and all Bitcoin pairs plummet. If it doesn't hold as support and we go back down to the bull market support band, then to be completely honest, I think that's it for a while. So, for me, it's a lot of if-then statements, right? If the 8-week holds, then bounce into the halving until all Bitcoin pairs break down, right? So let me sort of write out the thought process, right? So it goes, if Bitcoin is greater than the 8-week SMA, then bounce until all Bitcoin pairs break down. Right? If Bitcoin stays greater than the 8-week moving average, bounce into the halving, right? Bounce into halving until all Bitcoin pairs break down. The other one is if Bitcoin is putting in a weekly close below the 8-week moving average, then you're likely going to just slowly bleed back to the bull market support band. At which point I doubt it holds that support. Because in 2019 it did it. After we went, as long as you're retesting it every 3 to 4 months, it holds. But I think we're too far gone for it to hold. So the only way that the rally continues is if we just don't test it, right? If we just don't test the bull market support band. If we don't test it, then we don't have to deal with the consequences of it. So that's my view, right? That's my view. So I think a lot of it is going to come down to whether Bitcoin holds the 8-week moving average or not. And if you think about it, like when I did my video a couple days ago, Bitcoin was at like 68K, then it was at 65K, then today it's gone down to like 62K. If you get another $3,000 drop and you go sub 60K, interestingly enough, tomorrow is FOMC, then that would be the area to see if it holds. 58 to 59K to 60K, right? That would be the level to see if it holds or not. And if it does hold, my guess, if we hold it as support, my guess is that we rally into the halving until alt Bitcoin pairs break down. And again, back over here in 2019, it took 3 weeks, right? From when we went back to the 8-week moving average, it was a 3-week rally. What's interesting is if you get a 3-week rally by Bitcoin, let's say starting next week, right? If you get that, what's fascinating about it, right? What's absolutely fascinating about it is total 3 minus USD divided by Bitcoin. So if you draw this support here, and then you draw it over here, what you'll notice is that from this low, it took 41 weeks to break down. From this low, 41 weeks is basically 3 weeks from now, right? Let me zoom in to get this exact, right? But yeah, it's essentially mid-April. So that I think is what to look for here. Is it simply repeating this pattern where alt Bitcoin pairs sort of went to the range low right there, rallied to just above the 8-week moving average, and then aggressively rolled over? Now, then they rolled over, and then Bitcoin topped just before the first rate cut. First rate cut occurred in July, and Bitcoin topped in June. I know the market right now is saying that the rate cut of a rate cut in May is very low, only 6.2%. I'm not so sure. I mean, I will defer to the market on this, but if you get a 4% unemployment rate print in April, then that could be a great reason why they might cut as early as May. And then it would make a lot of sense if that were to happen, because then you could have sort of the final high by Bitcoin. I mean, it could theoretically be in already or in April, and then the first rate cut occurs in May, and then ETH Bitcoin breaks down in May. So alt Bitcoin pairs durably break down in April. Remember, last cycle, while alt Bitcoin pairs broke down in June, ETH Bitcoin did not break down until July, right? It took another 2 weeks. It took another month. I mean, it was the following month. It took about 2 more weeks for it to break down. So I'm wondering if you look at year-to-date ROI, like if you do get a rally by Bitcoin into the halving, maybe that is where alt Bitcoin pairs break down. And then perhaps it's a lower high in May where ETH Bitcoin breaks down. It's like the opposite of what we saw back in 2021, because in 2021, when this was all happening, liquidity was flowing from Bitcoin to altcoins, but now you're seeing liquidity flow from altcoins to Bitcoin. I think it's the reverse, right? I really do. I think it's reversed. I think instead of people keep calling for alt season, but I don't know what all, I mean, dominance of Bitcoin just keeps on going up. So my view continues to be, right, risk on until 56% dominance. That doesn't mean that you have to put in a new high until 56%, but I still think that we will be above, say some of these critical moving averages like the bull market support band until we're at least at 56%, if not 60% dominance. So that's my view here, is that dominance is going to break out in April. I think that alt Bitcoin pairs are going to break down below support. I think ETH Bitcoin could also break down in April, but it might hang on until might hang on a little bit longer, maybe until May. I don't know, maybe even long. The only real weird thing with Ethereum is that it's already near the range lows, so maybe it doesn't. I mean, some of the altcoins, frankly, are actually showing a little bit more strength than Ethereum. So maybe it doesn't have until May. Maybe it breaks down sooner, but I don't know. I mean, Ethereum has gone down a lot recently. It could get a bounce off of the range lows and then just kick the can down the road a little bit. But that's what I'm looking at right now with Bitcoin. I think it really does ultimately boil down to, does the 8-week hold or not? If it holds, I think you get a bounce into the halving where alt Bitcoin pairs break down. If it doesn't hold, then I think you get a slow, painful bleed back to the 20-week SMA. So I would keep an eye on that, right? When we were at 39K, again, I did plenty of live streams. People were saying, like, are we going to get a pre-halving dip? My response was, what if that is the pre-halving dip? Now we find ourselves in a very similar situation where Bitcoin is down 16.5%. Remember, back in 2019, it dropped 18% before reversing. That would get you down to 59 to 60K, just above the 8-week moving average. So keep an eye on that level. If it holds at 59K, then we figure out if we can break alt Bitcoin pairs down on the next rally. Because it always comes back to that, right? It always comes back to, can they break down or not? And so far, they just simply haven't broken down. So that's where we stand, right? And, I think there's always things that could throw it off course. You might say, well, what would cause Bitcoin to not hold the 8-week moving average? I really don't know. I mean, it could be any sort of things. I mean, it could be like an unemployment rate print way off the chart, like well above 4% or something. But my guess is, like, imagine we do get an unemployment rate print of, say, like 4% or let's say 3.9%. But even if it's staying high, it could lead to people sort of losing faith in altcoins, because it seems like the inevitable outcome is for the unemployment rate to go higher. And so they all just sort of flock over to Bitcoin. And it's that liquidity from the altcoin market that acts as fuel for Bitcoin, right? It's what acts as fuel for Bitcoin. So that's what I would be looking at with regards to Bitcoin USD. For me, as I've said forever, I stubbornly do not have much exposure to the altcoin market. The reason I say much is not because I haven't bought any. It's just that I have some bags from like years and years ago. But I've said for a long time, I'm still mostly just Bitcoin, because I think Bitcoin dominance is going up. And I think, as I said in the video yesterday, the one shining moment video for Bitcoin dominance, I think we are coming to the crescendo where it's about to explode to the upside, and alt Bitcoin pairs will bleed back to it. That is my view. I really do think alt Bitcoin pairs are going to bleed. And I think that the best opportunity for all of this to play out is April. It's the halving. It is potentially 1 to 3 months before the first rate cut. It is, gold has already broken out. USDT dominance trend line has already been tagged. It doesn't mean we can't go below it. Maybe we go back down to it, but maybe the next time we go back down to it, Bitcoin's up a lot and alts are nowhere near their prior highs. Or some of them might be, but some of them could be where, well below those highs. So that's what I keep sort of going back to is, is that going to happen? And I mean, that you could make a case for, why the high could already theoretically be in, right? I mean, if you look at things like sort of the extension from the prior cycle, like sort of the fib retracement tool from here, you can see that Bitcoin has basically retraced, almost basically to the penny to the 4.236 retracement, right? So maybe that's it. Like, I mean, maybe that's all we get. But even if it is, I mean, what if it plays out like this, right? Where you get sort of a high and then you get sort of, say, slightly higher highs. Like maybe it wicks above it up into this range. And then after alt Bitcoin pairs have finally broken down, then Bitcoin can finally cool off. The other idea is that if it just simply bounces, my argument is that it will, if we hold the 8-week moving average, my argument is it'll go as high as it needs to break alt Bitcoin pairs down. I think this is it, right? I think that April is the time for alts to break down. That is my view. We've been watching it forever. I'm growing old. I want resolution, right? This was 41 weeks before it broke down. We are currently at 38 weeks, right? 38 weeks right now. Remember, after all Bitcoin pairs hit that high back over there, it was a 3-week rally by Bitcoin. And then they broke down. One thing to look for, by the way, if it is going to follow sort of the shape of the 2019 pattern, is what happens this week is kind of irrelevant as long as the 8-week moving average holds, right? It's kind of irrelevant. What I would look for, right? What I would really look for is next week. What happens next week? Because if it's going to follow the 2019 pattern, then next week should theoretically see Bitcoin reclaim these prior highs, right? So look to see what happens next week, right? Can Bitcoin reclaim these prior highs, right? Can it get back up to 70K? If it can, then it might imply it's going to follow the 2019 pattern for the entire time, right? You first get your 190% rally, you go back down, you test your 8-week moving average, and then you get your final move where alt Bitcoin pairs break down. The reality of the situation, just to be completely honest, is I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, I can come up with 1,000 different reasons why it should play out this way or that way. I could go find, I just showed sort of the bullish view on it. I could also go show you things like USDT dominance and say, like, it kind of seems like we've already hit this trend line. The counterpoint is that, like, these trend lines, they are diagonal trend lines get broken. I mean, it's not going to hold forever. And maybe this is where and by the way, I mean, it could go back down here and tag the trend line, and Bitcoin could even be at a higher price, right? That's what happened over here. There's just a rotation of capital. So maybe this is where the trend line breaks. I really don't know. But I will say that I think next week, really going into the end of March, will set us up for what's going to happen in April. If Bitcoin can get back up, if it can hold the 8-week SMA this week and get back up here to the range highs before the end of March, then I think it would, you likely get that 2-week rally in April, sort of a rally for the first couple of weeks into the halving, and then finally the market cools off for, the next 6 months or something. But if the 8-week doesn't hold and we just go below 59K and we start to sink, then I think that's it, right? I think we would just sort of slowly bleed back to the 20-week SMA, where I think it would not hold as support. Sort of like from a sort of a higher view up, you can see sort of this initial rally, consolidation, move up, 8-week final move, right? Same thing, right? You have your sort of your initial move up, consolidation, rally up, go to the 8-week, and then whatever your final move is, whether it's a lower high, a higher high, whatever, I don't know. But what I do think is that whatever it ends up being, all Bitcoin pairs break down. That's my view. And I've said many times that what will likely mark the end of the rally, the end of the risk on dynamic, is when Bitcoin dominance breaks out. Right? When Bitcoin dominance breaks out above this level, that I think is what marks the end of it. And what's interesting is you can kind of see almost the exact same pattern, right? You guys remember here when Bitcoin USD in May, it came up to this level and then it retraced back down here into early June. And then it had a rally up. And when it broke through, right, when it took out this high, that's what marked the top for Bitcoin USD. So in this case, A weekly close above 55.33%, in my mind, marks the end of it. Whether it's a lower high or a higher high, I think that would mark the end of the rally, and then the market finally cools off. So my guess is that, speculators, we're going to still speculate here for a little bit, in terms of all the memes and the altcoins and whatnot. But I'm guessing that after the halving, once we're then faced with the dilemma of having to look towards rate cuts and what damage the Fed has done, that I think is sort of the next chapter, right? Right now, it's basically, let's just ignore all the macro. But if you look closely, the macro is not being ignored because alts are bleeding to Bitcoin. High risk is bleeding to low risk, right? So that's what I would look for. I think the next story will be, how much damage has the Fed done? Until that, we need to first get through the halving. Likely, alt Bitcoin pairs break down in April. Maybe ETH also breaks down in April. Maybe it doesn't happen until May, right? And if it happens in May, perhaps that'll correspond to, rate cuts either in May or June, right? So that's what I'm looking at right now. And we'll see, there are some sort of things to look at here, and that's the fact that, this consolidation period here was shorter than this one. So it's possible that, this period here is shorter than whatever this one ends up being. You can see this was like a 1 or 2 weeks, and maybe you have this one be 2 to 3 weeks or 2 to 4 weeks, or maybe it goes all the way out until the end of March or something. I don't know. But I think once April arrives, if we're still holding above the 8-week SMA by the time April gets here, then my guess is that you will see finally alts rotate into Bitcoin going into the halving. That's where alt Bitcoin pairs break down. Bitcoin finally confirms whatever high it's going to be at, and then we face the reality of how much damage the Fed has done. And then, whether it goes higher and then bleeds, whether it bleeds from here, this is, that will sort of be sort of the next phase, I think, of figuring out how much damage the Fed has done to the U.S. economy and all of the rate cuts that come with that. So please just be aware. I know a lot of people are really excited right now, and a lot of people are making a lot of money, not only on Bitcoin, but also in the altcoin market. But it's not about what you make, it's about what you keep. And my view, again, has been Bitcoin heavy for the last 2 years. You can see why. Bitcoin's at new all-time highs. Most altcoins are nowhere close. And I think a lot of people make the mistake of just throwing money into a lot of altcoins in the hopes that they'll catch up with Bitcoin. But the reality is that Bitcoin's likely going to continue to outperform them, not only to the upside, but also to the downside. So even when Bitcoin does top out, alts will still likely underperform Bitcoin for a couple months. It's a brutal world for the altcoin market. If you value them on their USD pairs, you're probably happy. If you value them on their Bitcoin pairs, you kind of see a completely different story. So next month, April, I think is the month that alt Bitcoin pairs finally break down. We'll see if that happens. And we will see if Bitcoin can hold the 8-week moving average. If it can't, then I will do a video where we really focus on that, right? If Bitcoin cannot hold the 8-week moving average like 2019, right? Again, in 2019, it held it. And, this is the only red candle we had, so I was looking at that one. But no, there was a red candle right here already. So, what if that red candle corresponds to that one, and this move here is already the move we just saw, right? Possibility, right? It's possible that could be the case. I think what we have to look at, what I will continue to look at, is just, does the 8-week hold? If it holds, then that, I sort of outlined the strategy, what I would be looking for going into April. If it doesn't hold, then you likely just get sort of the reverse, right? Where Bitcoin drops into the bull market support band and all Bitcoin pairs get absolutely annihilated, as well as all USD pairs, right? So, and again, you can kind of see Look at like total 3 minus USD out of Bitcoin, right? You can see that this here, if you were to overlay total 3 onto the chart, you can see that essentially what happened was like, you know, the altcoin market, it had a high and then it had a low, and then it went up. Like this low right here on total 3 occurred right around the time that alt Bitcoin pairs were turning the corner, right? So if that's playing out, then what happened is that total 3 puts in a very slightly higher high, like a very slightly higher high, if Bitcoin were to get that rally into the halving. But the issue is that alts really only went marginally higher, right? Like they went from like 81.5 billion to 87.5 billion. They didn't really go that much higher, despite the fact that Bitcoin rallied another 50%, right? And if you look, right, I mean, if you look at total 3, here, and we so if you look at total 3, that's the question, right? Like if it's late May, early June 2019, are we right here? You know, is that where it is? Could be, right? Could be. The problem is that alts only went up very slightly more, while Bitcoin went up a ton after that, and it broke alts down. They couldn't keep pace with it, right? So that's why I think that like as the macro continues to unfold, as the unemployment rate continues to go up, people are going to throw their hands up when it comes to alts. They're like, well, I'm not going to get into alts, but I'll go into Bitcoin. What's interesting is if you look at this fib retracement, a slightly higher high by alts would put them at the 618, right? They already went to 788 billion. The 618 is at 805 billion. The reason why that's interesting is because and we've talked about this idea before, like what if altcoin patterns are about one cycle behind Bitcoin? Because last cycle, Bitcoin rallied to the 618, right? Before reversing course. And now Bitcoin is, put in new highs, right? But what's fascinating is that like it rallied to the 618 before reversing course. And then if you scroll this all the way across, right? If we take this all the way across, as I showed earlier, right to the 4.236, right? I mean, basically to the dollar, right? I think it's fascinating, honestly. I mean, I do. I think that what to look for is going into the halving. If the 8-week holds, going into the halving, do the altcoins finally break down? And if they do, then I think that is your risk off signal if they break down. And there's a risk that they break down on a Bitcoin dump, which is a reality that you have to face. Unfortunately, with investing, there is no free lunch. I wish there were, but there is no free lunch. My only point is that Bitcoin has been the far safer investment, and it has given better returns than most altcoins, right? Than most altcoins. Not all, for the reply people that want to tell me which ones have outperformed. Not all, but most. So if you see Bitcoin, go back up to this level here, or even take it out, I mean, who am I to say that it can't take out the 4.236? If you go look at like the NASDAQ, it's gone well above the prior highs, right? So I don't want to say that it can't do that. It could. Even these wicks, went above the 3.618, right? We still say they just topped out at 3.618, but the reality is that Bitcoin, went 7% above the 618, right? So, I mean, again, like 7% above this level is 79K. Inflation adjusted, I think the high for Bitcoin is around 79K, if I'm not mistaken. Because again, if you adjust for inflation, I think you could argue that Bitcoin hasn't even put in new highs. But I think around 79K would be a new high. If you connect the dots on Bitcoin USD from, say, like, well, let me do it on a log scale. I don't really think it makes sense to do it on a linear scale, but if you do it on a log scale and you connect these dots, that would be in the 80s, right? If you connect the dots, though, divided by M2, we've already hit it, and you can see that, we sort of had this low here and then a slightly lower low here, a high, a slightly higher high, and then now we've hit that trend line again. You see the dilemma? Like, no matter what I do, I can find like pieces of evidence to support the bearish case and say, well, look, it's hit the trend line. Or I could say, no, it hasn't if you don't account for M2, right? I could just say, well, why don't you just look at it like this and, see if it can go higher, right? And I can go look at USDT dominance and say, well, what if it goes back to the trend line? There exists a scenario where Bitcoin puts in a higher high and USDT dominance still holds the trend line. Because while Bitcoin's going higher, the altcoin market's not going anywhere. Durably, that is. I mean, if Bitcoin goes up, of course, the altcoin market will follow. I mean, if you look at Ethereum, right? If you look at Ethereum, you sort of had a very similar pattern, right? Where it sort of had this move right here, sort of like this sort of move, and then a pop up, right? Kind of the same thing, right? Like a slow move here, and then a pop up, and then it sort of came back down, and then one final move, and then it came down, right? Is it going to go one final move up? I don't know. I don't really care about Ethereum at this stage of the cycle. I think that it's going to bleed against Bitcoin no matter what, so I don't really care what it does. I think that the inevitable outcome for ETH is a bleed to 0.03 to 0.04. And remember last cycle when it broke down, it was actually on a lower high. It wasn't even on the high. So if Bitcoin goes into a situation where it holds the 8-week SMA and puts in a higher high, look at the year-to-date ROI. Let's say if it follows, say, 2021, where it puts in a higher high in April, you could have an example where then it fades, and then it puts in a lower high in May, and then that's where ETH Bitcoin breaks down. Again, I don't really care when it breaks down. I just think it will break down. So certainly a lot of interesting things here, guys. And I wish I had all the answers, but I don't. We look at a lot of different things. We look at risk metrics. We look at dominance, and I try to put the pieces of the puzzle together. And oftentimes I get it wrong. Is the reality, right? I often get it wrong. I think the thing I've been the most right about is that Bitcoin dominance continues going up, and if it follows last cycle and Bitcoin gets a rally into the halving, then I think that alt Bitcoin pairs will finally break down as Bitcoin dominance breaks out. And then when Bitcoin corrects, then the altcoin market has nowhere to hide. Right now, I mean, Ethereum still theoretically has somewhere to hide, right? It's still above 0.049. So Bitcoin still has some work to do to break it down. The harsh reality, though, that sort of can make you a little uncomfortable if you're betting on higher highs, is that, and I said this earlier, but just to reiterate it, right? The harsh reality that I kind of is a little concerning is that when Bitcoin got that 3-week rally back then, ETH Bitcoin was up here. So it had more to give to go back down to the range lows. Now we're already kind of there. So like, there's not as much for ETH to give, right? And the issue is that ETH Bitcoin is dropping while Bitcoin is going down, right? So like, if Bitcoin continues to go down for a couple more weeks, or let's say it goes down for the next few days, what if ETH Bitcoin goes back down to the range low before you even get to the Bitcoin bounce potentially, even if there's going to be one, which we don't know if there's going to be, then it might be more likely to get a lower high, right? Because ETH Bitcoin doesn't have any left to give to break the range lows. So there's a lot of things. I mean, there's a lot of things to consider. I mean, if I only looked at alt Bitcoin pairs, I would say, oh, there's plenty of liquidity there, right? But the counterpoint is that if you look at total 2 minus USD divided by Bitcoin, there's not as much, right? Like it's already, it's already not that far away from these range lows, right? It's at 78%. The range lows are around like 72%. Here it dropped from 72 all the way down to 58 to break the range lows. Here there's not as much to give. Now maybe that means it just goes down here and then we repeat the process, right? Maybe it sort of breaks down and then we sort of repeat the process again. I hope not, but it's possible. So again, alt Bitcoin pairs imply there's still liquidity there. ETH Bitcoin kind of implies that there's a little bit, but there's not a lot. Gold is sort of signaling, hey, things are risky. USDT dominance is signaling, hey, we've gotten a little heated. Fear and greed has already gone to the 90s. Maybe it can go a little bit higher since we put in new all-time highs. It already went to 90. If there is further upside with Bitcoin in April, then I still think that the upside for alts is going to be limited to potentially around the 618. Maybe a little bit high, maybe sort of this high here. Sort of wicking maybe into the low 800s, 834, 835 billion. 837 billion is the high from back over there. But yeah, I mean, you can kind of see like that's what ultimately happened with Total 3 back then was that it had that pullback. Bitcoin held the 8-week SMA and then it just put a slightly higher high, was unable to keep pace with Bitcoin. And I think a lot of it could come down to sort of the macro data coming into us in April. You might see Bitcoin just kind of like fade into 60K or 59K, bounce around there until we get all this unemployment rate data coming in April, and then decide what it's going to do. But still a ways to go to get to that point, and I will try to provide as many updates as I can. I will probably get most things wrong, is the reality. But the great thing is that I just trade the risk levels, right? I don't really trade all this stuff. I just say, hey, where's the risk of Bitcoin? If it's high, I take profits. If it's low, I buy in. That's about it. I don't want to make it any more complicated than that. I just want to, provide some insight. Because what am I going to say? I'm not going to come on here every single day and say, I'm buying some of the risk levels, right? I do want to provide some commentary on what the markets are doing as it relates to monetary policy. And, basically last cycle, we rallied until a month before rate cuts. And I don't think we're getting a rate cut tomorrow. So does that open the door for Bitcoin to finally break alts down in April? Maybe before a rate cut in May or June? Yeah, I think that's possible. But it's ultimately going to depend on if it holds the 8-week moving average or not. So if we hold the 8-week, bounce into the halving. Alt Bitcoin pairs break down. ETH Bitcoin breaks down too, maybe not until May. That's my view. If the 8-week does not hold, then I'll see you guys in 6 months. I mean, I'll still be here, but we'll just be playing chess. Okay? We're going to be playing chess either way, more than likely this summer, dealing with all the, sort of the Fed cuts and everything. But that's the level. 38, 39K. Maybe now it's going to be like 58 to 59K, 60K. We'll see if it holds. If it does, you guys know my thoughts. If it doesn't, you guys know my thoughts. I mean, this drop by ETH is kind of a lot, honestly. I'm just kind of curious. This drop by ETH over here was about 20%. So where are we here? Yeah, it's already beyond that. But it is still above the 8-week, right? So if you look at ETH USD, in 2019, it stayed above the 8-week moving average. That was the key. It's getting close, right? The 8-week is at 31.21. You can go below it, right? I mean, we've gone below it, but you don't really want to be putting in multiple weekly closes below it. So if it comes back to that, right? If then, it's not Ben knows whether it's going to hold. It's if it holds throughout the rest of the month, then you likely see all Bitcoin pairs break down next month. On a theoretical Bitcoin rally, whether it's a lower high or a higher high, couldn't really care. So that's where we stand. Thank you guys for tuning in. Again, if you guys want to join the bracket challenge, you could win a 1-year subscription to ITC Premium for the winner. Password is BTC.D for Bitcoin dominance. So make sure you guys check that out. Looks like we already got about 500 entries, 507 entries. So if you want to be number 508, click the link in the description below or the pinned comment, and you can join the bracket challenge, and we'll see who wins that in March Madness. So maybe March Madness will not only refer to basketball, but maybe some madness over here in the altcoin market and cryptos. I think there's going to be a lot of changes coming up. I think everyone likes, I think the crescendo is almost here for dominance. It's almost here. A weekly close above 55.3%. I think that's it. Not in terms of Bitcoin dominance. I think then it goes to 60%. But in terms of Bitcoin USD, I think that's the signal. So anyways, we'll wrap it up there. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up. We also have the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.